In the mid-1970s, a man sat down in a university library to do something almost nobody had done before. He was working on a doctorate at Brigham Young University, and he had chosen an unusual subject. Not a single theory, not a single author. He was going to read the entire history of American success literature, every book, article, and essay he could find on how to succeed at life, published in the United States since 1776. 200 years of it, hundreds of books. Everything a free country had ever told itself about what makes a life work. Stephen Covey expected to find a body of accumulated wisdom, gradually refining itself, the way medicine or engineering refines itself. What he found instead was a break. For roughly the first 150 years, from the founding through to the First World War, the literature said essentially one thing: success is a byproduct of character. It talked about integrity, humility, courage, justice, patience, industry, simplicity, modesty. The idea that there are principles of effective living and that a life works when a person builds those principles into who they actually are. The model of the genre was Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, which is fundamentally the story of a man trying to install virtues in himself. Then, shortly after the First World War, the subject changed. Success stopped being about character and became about personality, about public image, about attitude, technique, and the skills that smooth the surface of human interaction. Two paths opened up, one about human relations technique, and one about positive mental attitude, and between them, they took over the entire field. Covey read 50 years of that material and reached a conclusion he found genuinely disturbing. Most of it was superficial. It was social image, technique, and quick fixes, band-aids and aspirin, addressing sharp pain and sometimes appearing to work, while the underlying chronic problem sat underneath untouched, festering, and coming back. And here's what makes this personal rather than academic. While he was reading all this, Covey and his wife were struggling with their own son, trying every technique the literature offered, and watching none of them work. So he wrote a different kind of book. It came out in 1989 with a subtitle most people never notice: Restoring the Character Ethic. It has now sold more than 40 million copies. Today we're going through all 7 habits, in order, with the structure Covey built underneath them, because this book is not a list, and treating it as a list is the single most common way to misread it. We'll cover what a paradigm actually is and why he starts there. The 3 habits that make you independent, the 3 that make you effective with other people, and the 7th, which almost everybody skips. And near the end, I'm going to give you the honest case against this book, including a specific and rather awkward problem with its most famous quotation, one that Covey himself was responsible for, and that has been repeated by millions of people ever since. Stay for that part. Before the first habit, Covey asks you to consider a situation. Suppose you're trying to find a specific address in Chicago, and you've got a detailed street map. The map is accurate, well-printed, and easy to follow. But it's a map of Detroit. Now, what will fix your problem? Trying harder won't. You'll just get lost faster. A better attitude won't either. You'll be cheerfully, energetically lost. You could work on your behavior and your technique for a decade, and it would not help you at all. Because the problem is not with your effort. The problem is that you're holding the wrong map. Covey's word for the map is a paradigm. It's the way you see something, not what you think about it, but the frame that decides what you're capable of thinking about it. And his central claim is that these maps are almost entirely invisible to us. We don't think we have a view of the world, we think we have the world. His illustration of what happens when a map changes is the most famous passage in the book, and it's worth telling properly. He's on a subway in New York on a Sunday morning. It's quiet. People are reading, or dozing, or sitting with their own thoughts. A man gets on with his children, and the children are immediately, wildly out of control, shouting, grabbing things, running between the seats. And the father sits down next to Covey, closes his eyes, and does absolutely nothing. Covey sits with this. The whole carriage is being disturbed. Eventually, with what he describes as considerable restraint, He says something to the man about his children. The father opens his eyes, as though he's just noticed where he is. And he says, quietly, that they've just come from the hospital where the children's mother died about an hour ago. He says he doesn't know what to think, and he supposes the children don't know how to handle it either. Covey writes that everything changed in that instant. Not his behavior changed as a consequence. What changed first was what he was seeing. The same children, the same noise, the same man doing nothing. A completely different situation. That is the whole argument of the book in one story. You don't get large changes in your life by adjusting behavior on top of a faulty map. You get them when the map itself changes, and then the behavior follows without effort, because it's the only thing that makes sense anymore. Which is why the 7 habits are not techniques. Covey's claim is that they're descriptions of what a person naturally does once they're seeing accurately. 2 more pieces before the habits, and they're the parts most summaries drop. The first is the shape. Covey argues that human growth moves along a line from dependence to independence to interdependence. Dependence is you. You take care of me, you're responsible for how I feel, you're to blame. Independence is I can do this, I'm responsible, I choose. Interdependence is we. We can combine what we each have and produce something neither of us could alone. Our culture, he says, treats independence as the finish line. It isn't. Independence is a real and necessary achievement, and it is the middle of the map. Interdependence is a higher position, not a lesser one, but you cannot reach it from dependence. You can only reach it from independence, because interdependence between 2 people who can't stand on their own isn't partnership. It's just 2 dependencies leaning on each other. Habits 1, 2, and 3 take you from dependence to independence. Covey calls that the private victory. Habits 4, 5, and 6 take you from independence to interdependence, the public victory. And the 7th renews all 6. The order is not decorative. You cannot do the second 3 first, and most people trying to fix their relationships are trying to do exactly that. The second piece is a balance he calls P and PC, production, and production capability. His illustration is Aesop's fable about the goose that laid golden eggs. A farmer finds his goose producing a solid gold egg every day. He gets rich. Then he gets greedy and impatient, kills the goose to get all the eggs at once, and discovers there's nothing inside. The eggs are production. The goose is the capacity to produce. Push the goose hard enough, and you get more eggs for a while, and then you get nothing at all. Apply that to a body, a marriage, a team, a machine, a reputation, and you have most of the avoidable disasters in adult life. We are extremely good at counting eggs, and extremely bad at noticing the state of the goose. Habit 1. Be proactive. Not in the sense the word has come to mean energetic, taking initiative, getting ahead of things. Covey means something narrower and much harder. Between what happens to you and what you do about it, there is a gap, and in that gap, you choose. An animal doesn't have this. A stimulus arrives and a response follows, and the 2 are effectively welded together. Covey's argument is that human beings have 4 things sitting inside that gap: self-awareness, imagination, conscience, and independent will. Which means the response is never automatic, however much it feels automatic. The opposite of proactive is reactive, and you can hear the difference in ordinary sentences, which is what makes this immediately usable. There's nothing I can do. That's just how I am. He makes me so angry. They won't allow it. I have to. Against. Let's look at the alternatives. I can choose a different approach. I control how I feel about this. I will. Listen to that second set for a moment. The reactive sentences all locate the cause somewhere outside the speaker. The proactive ones all locate it inside. Same events, completely different position. And Covey makes a hard claim here that people push back on. Nobody can hurt you without your consent. What damages us, he argues, is not usually what happened, but our chosen response to what happened. That's a difficult thing to hear about serious injury, and it's worth noticing that he's describing something like a long-run orientation rather than denying that pain is real. The practical tool in this chapter is the one that has outlived everything else. Draw a large circle. Everything you care about goes inside it. The economy, your health, the political situation, your children, the weather, your workload, a war on the other side of the world. Covey calls it the circle of concern. Now draw a smaller circle inside it, containing only the things you can actually do something about. That's the circle of influence. Here's the observation. Proactive people put their energy into the inner circle, and because attention and effort are what grow things, the inner circle expands. Reactive people pour their energy into the outer ring, the parts they can only comment on, worry about, and resent. That energy produces nothing, generates a constant sense of being acted upon, and the inner circle quietly shrinks. Almost everybody reading this knows someone who is exhausted from caring intensely about things they will never touch. Some weeks, it's all of us. Habit 2. Begin with the end in mind. Covey opens this one with an exercise that is genuinely uncomfortable, and I'd suggest actually doing it rather than just hearing it. Picture yourself driving to a funeral. You park, you go in, and you gradually realize, as you look around, that the funeral is yours. These are the people who came. Everyone in the room is there for you. 4 people are going to speak. 1 from your family, 1 friend, 1 from your work, 1 from your community or church, or whatever you belong to. Now the question. What do you want them to say? Not what would they probably say. What do you want them to say? What character do you want them to have seen? What contribution? What sort of husband, wife, parent, colleague, neighbor do you want to have actually been? Whatever came into your head just then is your definition of success. And most people discover, sitting with it honestly, that it doesn't match how they spent last week. That gap is what this habit is about. Covey's claim is that everything is created twice. There's a mental creation and then a physical one. A building exists in a drawing before it exists in bricks. If the drawing is wrong, no amount of quality bricklaying saves it. A life is the same, except that most lives are never given a first creation at all. They're built directly, in real time, out of whatever came up, other people's agendas, family scripts, the pressure of the immediate, and the person living it never sits down and decides what's being built. His image for this is the one that gives the video its second-best title. You can spend 30 years climbing a ladder with enormous discipline and reach the top and discover the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. Efficiency has no opinion about direction. You can be extremely efficient at going somewhere you never wanted to go. The practical instrument is a personal mission statement, a written description of what you're for, which he says takes weeks or months rather than an afternoon. And underneath that, he asks a diagnostic question worth the whole chapter. What is at the center of your life? Because something is. If your center is your work, then a threat to your work is a threat to your identity, and you'll defend it past the point of sense. If it's money, every decision runs through a calculation that can't measure most of what matters. If it's your spouse, or your children, or being right, or an enemy, or pleasure, or approval, each of those produces a specific and predictable distortion in your judgment, because everything else gets measured against a center that can't bear the weight. Covey's alternative is a life centered on principles, precisely because principles don't move, don't die, don't leave, and don't need managing. Habit 3. Put first things first. Habit 1 says you can choose. Habit 2 says what to choose. Habit 3 is the daily execution, and it's where the book gives you its most borrowed diagram. Take everything you do and sort it on 2 axes. Is it urgent? Does it demand attention right now? And is it important? Does it contribute to the mission you just defined? That gives 4 quadrants. Quadrant 1 is urgent and important. Crises, deadlines, emergencies. Real work that genuinely must happen now. Quadrant 2 is important but not urgent. Planning, prevention, relationship building, learning, exercise. The long conversation you keep not having. Quadrant 3 is urgent but not important. Most interruptions. Most phone calls. Many meetings. Other people's priorities arriving with a sense of emergency attached. Quadrant 4 is neither. Trivia. Busy work. Escape. Now the point. Effective people live in Quadrant 2, and hardly anybody does, because Quadrant 2 never announces itself. Nothing in Quadrant 2 will ever knock on your door. It has no deadline, no ringing phone, no irritated colleague. It waits patiently while you handle everything that shouts. And here's the mechanism worth understanding. Quadrant 2 is where Quadrant 1 gets prevented. Almost every crisis you'll deal with this year is a Quadrant 2 item that was ignored long enough to become urgent. The health problem, the client who leaves, the marriage that fails, the system that collapses, those were all quiet and non-urgent once. So people who neglect Quadrant 2 spend their lives in Quadrant 1, exhausted, firefighting, and calling it being busy. And when Quadrant 1 wears them out, they don't recover in Quadrant 2. They collapse into Quadrant 4, because Quadrant 4 is where you go when you have nothing left. The only place to get Quadrant 2 time is out of 3 and 4, which means this habit is mostly about saying no, and Covey's point is that you can only say a comfortable no to something unimportant when you have a burning yes about something else. Without habit 2, you have no grounds to refuse anything. Habit 4. Think win-win. Now we cross from the private victory into the public one, and notice that Covey has spent a third of the book before saying a word about other people. That ordering is the argument. He lays out 6 ways 2 people can approach anything. Win-lose. I get mine, you don't. This is most of what we're trained into. School ranking, sport, comparison between siblings, most negotiation. Lose-win. I give in. I'm the accommodating one. I keep the peace. I have no standards I'll defend. Covey is blunt that this is worse than it looks, because suppressed feelings don't disappear. They come back later as disproportionate anger, cynicism, or illness. Lose-lose. 2 win-lose people locked together. The divorce where one would rather destroy the asset than let the other have it. Win. I just want mine and I'm indifferent to yours. Win-win. Both parties leave genuinely satisfied and committed. Not a compromise where each gets half, but an outcome both actually want. And the 6th, which is the one that makes the whole thing workable. Win-win or no deal. If we can't find something that's genuinely good for both of us, we agree to have no agreement, pleasantly, and walk away. That option is what stops win-win from collapsing into lose-win, because it means you can hold out for something real without becoming an adversary. The requirement underneath all of this is what Covey calls an abundance mentality, the belief that there's enough. Scarcity thinking sees a fixed pie. Your success is subtracted from mine, and someone else's promotion is my loss. People operating from scarcity find it almost impossible to be genuinely pleased for anyone, including people they love. And he introduces the metaphor that has outlived the book, the emotional bank account. Every interaction is a deposit or a withdrawal. Courtesy, kindness, honesty, keeping small commitments, deposits. Broken promises, discourtesy, betrayals, the sarcastic remark in front of other people, withdrawals. The consequence is not obvious until you see it. A relationship with a large balance survives a mistake easily. You can be short with someone, or forget something, or handle a moment badly, and it costs almost nothing, because there's reserve. Communication is barely necessary. The other person fills in the generous interpretation automatically. A relationship already overdrawn has no reserve at all. And in that state, the smallest thing, a tone, a delay in replying, a word chosen badly, triggers an enormous reaction. The 2 people then argue about the tone, or the delay, or the word, forever, and neither of them ever names what's actually happening, which is that there's nothing left in the account. That's why so many arguments are wildly out of proportion to their subject. The subject was never the problem. Habit 5. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. Covey says, This is the single most important principle in interpersonal relations, and he introduces it with an image that lands immediately. Imagine going to an optician about your eyes. He listens for about 10 seconds, then takes off his own glasses and hands them to you, telling you to wear them. He's had them for years, they work wonderfully, and he has a spare pair at home. You put them on, and everything is a blur. You tell him. He says try harder. You say you can't see anything. He tells you to be positive. You say it isn't working, and he gets irritated, and says he doesn't understand it. They work fine for him. Nobody would accept 30 seconds of that. And it is precisely what almost all of us do in conversation. We prescribe before we diagnose. We hear a fragment of someone's situation, match it to something in our own history, and start dispensing. Covey breaks down what we're actually doing while pretending to listen, and it's an uncomfortable list. We evaluate, we agree or disagree. We probe, we ask questions from our own frame of reference. We advise, we give counsel out of our own experience. We interpret, we explain the other person's motives to ourselves, based on ours. All four are autobiographical. All four are about us. What he's asking for instead is empathic listening, listening with the intent to understand, rather than the intent to reply. Not agreeing, understanding, getting far enough inside someone's frame that you could state their position better than they just did. And he makes a point about why this is so rarely done, which I think is the sharpest observation in the book. It's risky. To really listen to someone, you have to be open to being changed by what you hear. That's a genuine vulnerability, and it's the reason most people stay safely inside their own frame while nodding. Then the second half, which people forget is even there. Then to be understood. This is not a doctrine of endless selfless listening. Covey's point is sequencing. Understanding first buys you the standing to be heard, because a person who feels genuinely understood stops defending and becomes able to listen. Habit 6. Synergise. This is the one with the worst name, and underneath it is a simple and demanding idea. Two people who see the same thing the same way are not much use to each other. The value is in the difference, and most of us treat difference as a problem to be managed, negotiated down, or tolerated. Covey's claim is that when two people who genuinely respect each other's differences work on something together, a third alternative appears. Not your way, not my way, not the halfway compromise where we each give up a third of what we wanted. Something neither of us walked in with, and neither could have produced alone. The entry requirement is high, and it's the reason this habit is sixth. It needs habit 4, because if either party is playing win-lose, the other will defend rather than open up. And it needs habit 5, because you cannot build on a difference you haven't understood. The practical version is smaller than it sounds. Covey's own example is a domestic one. He wanted to take the family on a fishing trip to a lake he'd been planning for a year. His wife wanted to use the time to visit her mother, who was unwell and 250 miles in the other direction. Both positions were reasonable, both mattered, and the ordinary outcomes were all bad. One of them wins, and the other quietly resents it, or they split the difference and get a rushed half of each, which satisfies nobody and costs the whole holiday. So instead of negotiating positions, they talked about what each of them actually wanted underneath the position and stayed in that conversation past the point where it was comfortable. What eventually came out was a plan neither of them had walked in with, in a place neither had proposed, which did the thing he wanted and the thing she wanted at the same time. That's the shape of it. Not compromise, where both parties end up below where they started. A third option that neither had access to alone. The everyday form is the willingness, in a disagreement, to say that you see it differently and to mean it as an invitation. Most valuable ideas in a room arrive at the moment somebody says the awkward thing and the room decides to be curious about it rather than defensive. Covey's phrase for the alternative is that we tend to clone ourselves, surround ourselves with people who confirm what we already see, and then wonder why nothing new ever emerges. Habit 7. Sharpen the saw. You come across a man in a forest sawing down a tree. He's been at it for hours, he's exhausted, and the saw is blunt. You suggest stopping for a few minutes to sharpen it, and he says, without looking up, that he doesn't have time to sharpen the saw. He's too busy sawing. That's the habit. It's the P and PC balance from the beginning of the book, applied to the only instrument you actually own, yourself. Covey splits renewal into 4 dimensions: physical, exercise, nutrition, rest. The unglamorous base everything else stands on. Mental, reading, writing, planning, learning. He notes that formal education ends, and most people's serious reading ends with it. Spiritual, whatever connects you to your own values, scripture, meditation, music, time in nature. He's careful that this is a category rather than a prescription. Social and emotional, relationships, service, genuine connection. The only one of the 4 you can partly do while doing something else. And here's why this habit is last, and why it matters more than it seems. It's the quadrant 2 activity, the pure case. Nothing in this list is ever urgent. Nobody will ever require you to do any of it. You can neglect all 4 for a year, and nothing will visibly break, right up until several things break at once. It's also the habit that makes the other 6 repeatable rather than a phase. A person who does this on a schedule gets to keep the other 6. A person who doesn't gets an inspired fortnight, and then their old life back. Now the honest accounting, and I want to start with the specific problem I promised. The most famous line associated with this book is the one about the space between stimulus and response, that in that space lies our power to choose, and in our response lies our growth and our freedom. It is quoted constantly, on posters and in speeches, and it is almost always attributed to Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the camps. Frankl does not appear to have written it. According to the Viktor Frankl Institute, the trail leads back to Covey, who used to recount finding the passage in a book in a library, thinking it captured Frankl's views well, and not writing down the title or the author. From there, it entered the world with Frankl's name attached, and it has been repeated by millions of people ever since. That doesn't make the idea wrong. It's a fair summary of what Frankl argued, but it's a useful demonstration of how a thing becomes true by repetition, in a book whose entire argument is that we should be checking our maps. The bigger criticism is structural. Covey's foundation is the claim that principles are natural laws, self-evident, universal, and as real as gravity. That is a philosophical position, not a demonstrated one, and the book largely asserts it. The dissertation underneath the character versus personality story is a sweeping historical generalization that was never subjected to the kind of scrutiny that claim would need. Then there's the writing. This is a dense, abstract, heavily jargoned book. Paradigm, synergy, P/PC balance, emotional bank account, quadrant 2, the maturity continuum. Some of that vocabulary is genuinely useful, and some of it is a simple idea wearing a costume. It's one of the most bought and least finished books in the category, and the writing is why. And there's a fair charge that it's unfalsifiable. If you apply the habits and your life improves, the habits worked. If you apply them and nothing changes, you weren't applying them at a deep enough level. A framework that can't fail is not a framework you can test. Set against that, the parts that have held up extremely well. The circle of influence maps closely onto decades of research on locus of control, the finding that people who believe outcomes turn on their own actions do better on almost every measure than people who believe outcomes happen to them. Empathic listening is now standard in negotiation and clinical training. Quadrant 2, thinking is the backbone of most serious work on prioritization. So read it as a moral argument with some strong practical tools attached, rather than as a science. And be patient with the vocabulary, because underneath most of the jargon, there is a real idea that is worth the excavation. Come back to that library. A man spends years reading everything his country has ever written about how to succeed, and finds a break in the middle of it, a point where the whole conversation quietly stopped asking who you are and started asking how you come across. His diagnosis was that the second question is easier, faster, and more marketable, and that it doesn't work. Not because technique is worthless, but because technique sits on top of something, and if the thing underneath is hollow, the technique eventually shows you what's under it. That's an unfashionable argument. It was unfashionable in 1989, and it's more unfashionable now, in a decade of productivity systems and optimization and hacks, most of which are the personality ethic with better software. And it's worth noticing what the 7 habits actually are, stripped of the vocabulary. Take responsibility. Decide what you're for. Do that first. Want good outcomes for other people. Listen properly before you speak. Use the differences. Look after the instrument. None of that is clever. All of it is hard. That combination is the whole reason 40 million copies of the book exist, and most of them are unfinished. So here's my question for you. Do the 4 people at that funeral describe the person you actually were last week? Not last year. Not at your best. Last week. Put it in the comments. I read them, and that thread is always the most honest one under these videos. If this gave you something worth sitting with, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We break down one great book like this every week. 200 years of books, and the answer turned out to be the boring one. Stay sharp. I'll see you in the next one.